When was the last time you watched the ABC? I mean, for me, it's Saturday morning cartoons and rage music videos. I mean, that's pure 90s nostalgia right there. And the idea of a free-to-air channel is obviously quite appealing in a world full of subscriptions. And don't worry, it's definitely not free. I pay for it and you pay for it. Every Australian taxpayer pays for the ABC, and we'll dive into that in this video. But in a world full of YouTube and Spotify, Netflix, and every other streaming service you could possibly think of at your fingertips, do we still need public broadcasting? I don't know. Let's explore it. So, to understand it, let's go back to 1956, where TV had just arrived in time for every Australian to cheer on Aussie legend Dawn Fraser winning a gold medal in the Melbourne Olympics. The first station to begin regular broadcasting was Channel 9 in Sydney, followed by Channel 7 in Melbourne, and on November the 5th, 1956, the ABC began broadcasting in Sydney. Television was here.
Yes, in little more than a wink of time, television has entered our homes, our lives, and all this has been just the beginning.
So television was this incredible leap forward in entertainment. But it wasn't just Australia that was asking itself what this technology could be used for. You see, governments were grappling with the idea that something as powerful as television would be left entirely to commercial interests. So public broadcasting became a major part of the media landscape around the world. Britain has the BBC, Canada has the CBC, Australia has the ABC, so on and so forth. But why were governments so keen to get their own channel on the air? Well, to understand the original argument for public broadcasting, we need to understand the world in which it was created for. You see, back then, information wasn't everywhere. If you wanted weather, education, or information about what was happening in the world, there's only a handful of places you could get it. And that created a problem. Commercial broadcasters needed advertisers, and advertisers naturally want to reach as many people as possible. So commercial broadcasters had a strong incentive to focus on large population centres. But what about the things that are valuable to society but aren't exactly profitable? See, radio and television weren't just entertainment. They were vital information tools. Things like news, information, and educational programs can now come directly into people's homes. This is really important for people that lived in remote areas, especially things like emergency broadcasting. If there was a cyclone, a weather event, or any other type of emergency, we could get that information out to millions of people really quickly. So you can understand why public broadcasting became important. It wasn't because the market couldn't meet the needs. It was because it wasn't profitable for the market to meet those needs. That's why we had public broadcasting. So now that we've set the scene as to why public broadcasting was there, I'd say let's move forward. Let's go to the 1990s, where the internet was just becoming a thing. The internet was just beginning to spread beyond universities and research institutions, and everything was about to change. The world's information was no longer limited to what came through your television or radio. It was becoming available directly to you. With the advent of YouTube, Netflix, Spotify, and social media, now anybody with a mobile phone could potentially reach millions of people. When public broadcasting was created, it's because we had information scarcity. But today, we don't have too little information. We arguably have too much. And that creates an interesting question about one of the biggest arguments for public broadcasting: journalism. Now, the argument for publicly funded journalism is fairly simple. If a news organisation doesn't have to rely on advertising, clicks, and subscriptions, then its journalists can investigate stories that aren't exactly commercially viable. Because let's be honest, if it bleeds, it leads. More attention means more advertising, more revenue, and ultimately more sustainable business. And when a large media organisation is owned by a relatively small number of companies or families, there's a legitimate question about how much influence those owners can have over what gets covered. So the ideal of publicly funded journalism is those journalists should be serving the public, not the advertisers. But that then raises another interesting question. If commercial media can be influenced by the people that own those stations, what happens when it's the government that's paying the bills? Around the world, public broadcasting is funded in a few different ways. Some countries fund it directly through general taxation, and then there's the approach used by the BBC in Britain, which has traditionally relied on a specific charge for access to broadcasting services. In the UK, this is called a television licence. So if you consume BBC's live television or record it, or any of its digital products, you need a television licence. It's kind of like a mandatory subscription. But there is a clear distinction. If you don't watch any of the BBC's live products or its digital media, and you only consume things through streaming services like YouTube, Netflix, Spotify, or any other streaming service, you can technically cancel that license. So if you don't consume the BBC, you don't have to pay for it. Australia takes a very different approach. The ABC is primarily funded through the tax system, receiving about $1.4 billion in government funding, depending on exactly which funding components we include. So the question isn't simply, is $1.4 billion a lot of money to spend on the ABC? The question is more, what are Australians getting for that money? And are some of the issues that public broadcasting was set to solve now become obsolete? Well, today you can get news from thousands of sources. Entertainment is practically everywhere, and you can get free education online. Even people living in remote areas have access to services and technology like Starlink that weren't available when the ABC was created. So if the original problem was a lack of access to information, is that problem still big enough to justify something like the ABC and spending $1.4 billion? Well, some people out there argue that just because technology is caught up doesn't mean that the ABC is obsolete. And whether you're funded by government or large corporations, staying independent isn't easy. Commercial media has advertisers, public media has its governments. Both models are susceptible to funding pressures. If either actually achieve editorial independence is a much bigger debate, and one I would love to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. But before I go, I'd like to leave you with one last question. In a world where we have more access to information, news, and entertainment than anyone in 1956 could ever have imagined, if you were building Australia's media landscape today, would you build something like the ABC? Do you think it's justified that we spend $1.4 billion on a service that, let's be honest, most of you don't watch? Anyway, thanks for your time today. Appreciate it. Take care.